Hey, this is Greg with Engaging History. Today's video we're going to look at 50 historical references in the movie Forrest Gump. As I do with every video, first let's check out our featured quote. "The world is a book, and those who do not travel read only a page." That's from St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, also known as the Doctor of Grace, one of my favorites from antiquity. Remember, we study history to understand our world, avoid past mistakes, appreciate other cultures. And as I take you through these 50 references to history in Forrest Gump, keep in mind that I have a lesson linked below with all the 50 more in detail. That lesson, as well as all my lessons, are aimed to be both fun and challenging for students. Alright, Forrest Gump is one of my favorite movies of all time. When I used to teach US history in high school, this was a great movie to show because it has so many references to history. Each time I watched it with my classes, I picked up on more references and eventually came up with this list of 50. Alright, quick background on Forrest Gump. This is a 1994 film. It's based on a 1986 novel. It's not a true story, it's a fictional account, and it takes Forrest through all sorts of major historical events in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He runs into presidents, he fights in wars, and all sorts of other things. This list of 50 is going to come up in order of appearance in the film, which also means that it's coming up in chronological order, historically speaking. Even though Forrest Gump is historical fiction, it's adored across generations. It's a favorite for high school US history teachers, English teachers, humanities teachers, because of all the references to real history. Ready? Here we go. Number 1. Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was named after the Confederate general who founded the KKK in 1865. The KKK was a white supremacist group that was active in the late 1860s, right after the Civil War, again in the 20s, and then again in the 1960s. Number 2. Elvis Presley. Forrest's mom hosted travelers including Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was one of a handful of artists who transitioned music into the age of rock and roll. With artists like Elvis, it was less about the recording and more about the performance. Number 3. The nuclear family. Baby boomers grew up in post-World War II. Forrest had a single mom. Jenny had an abusive father. They are anomalies of the 1950s traditional family paradigms. The 1950s featured the nuclear family, with working fathers, stay-at-home mothers, and houses in the suburbs. But Forrest and Jenny represent exceptions to these social expectations. Number 4. The Confederate flag. Forrest runs from bullies with Confederate flag plates. This is common in the South as a cultural symbol. The Confederate flag is both a symbol of the pro-slavery South that seceded and fought a civil war, and a symbol of Southern heritage and cultural pride. Number 5. Alabama football. Forrest joins an all-white Alabama football team with legendary coach Bear Bryant. In real history, an integrated USC team beat the all-white Alabama team 42-21 in a 1970 game. All of USC's touchdowns were scored by black players. It was said that USC did more to integrate Alabama in 1 hour than Martin Luther King did in 20 years. Number 6. George Wallace. Forrest picks up a book for a, quote, colored student attempting to attend Alabama. George Wallace is mentioned. Governor Wallace famously said, "Segregation now, tomorrow, and forever." He was willing to challenge JFK and keep Alabama segregated. Number 7. Joan Baez. Joan Baez often sang with other folk and rock legends like Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Paul Simon, the Rolling Stones. Folk singers tell stories, usually about society, history, or social issues. Baez performed during arguably the most pivotal decades of US history. Number 8. President John F. Kennedy. As an all-American athlete, Forrest meets President Kennedy, then later mentions his death. JFK's legacy includes a speech in Berlin, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and working towards civil rights legislation before his assassination in 1963. Number 9. Robert Kennedy. Forrest mentions that JFK's brother was killed. Many believe that Bobby Kennedy would become president since LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, announced that he would not seek re-election. But because of his death, Nixon was able to become president in 1968. Number 10. Military service. Forrest volunteers for the Army. The GI generation, also known as the Greatest Generation, are remembered for their collective efforts in World War II. But the Silent Generation, and that would include Forrest Gump in this movie, fought in less popular wars, Korea and Vietnam, for example. Number 11. The military draft. Bubba mentions that he was drafted into the Army. The government initiated the draft for the growing conflict in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson raised troop levels above 500,000 before leaving office. Number 12. Segregated buses. Forrest boards a racially integrated military bus. This was because of Truman's executive order, which ended military segregation. On the civilian side, of course, the story of the civil rights is that the Montgomery bus boycott was a catalyst for the civil rights movement and eventually ended Jim Crow legislation. Number 13. Slavery. There are flashbacks that show that Bubba comes from a long line of house servants and house slaves. Different generations in Bubba's family are shown serving whites. Even though slavery was officially ended, you could see that the social order remained somewhat the same. Number 14. Beatniks. In Jenny's first stage performance in Memphis, Tennessee, she was introduced as a beatnik. The Beatniks, or the Beats as they were called, were the counterculture of the 1950s, and they were known for their lyric poetry, jazz, and rejection of mainstream American culture. Number 15, Bob Dylan. Jenny chooses the stage name Bobby Dylan. The real Bob Dylan was often called the voice of a generation. Rolling Stone magazine named him the number 2 greatest artist in music history behind the Beatles. Number 16, the Vietnam War. Forrest was sent to Vietnam. The Vietnam War was, of course, a Cold War theater. The U.S. went there to contain the spread of communism, also known as containment policy, and to stop the falling dominoes of communism, also known as domino theory. Number 17, U.S. Imperialism. Bubba tells of plans for shrimping and other U.S. business in Vietnam after the war. The United States, of course, has a long history of seeking markets around the world in developing nations, such as in Asia or Latin America. Number 18, Revolutionary War. In a series of flashbacks, a relative of Lieutenant Dan dies in the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was caused by high taxes, a lack of colonial voice in England. The colonies fought for independence, resulting in the establishment of the United States. Number 19, Civil War. As part of that same flashback, one of Lieutenant Dan's relatives dies in the Civil War. The Civil War was caused by different views over states' rights and slavery. It was fought between the North and the South over 4 years, resulting in a North victory and a reunited nation. Number 20, World War I. Again, in that flashback, Lieutenant Dan's relative dies in World War I. World War I was caused by a complicated alliance system, nationalism, and, of course, an assassination. The U.S. got involved because of the Zimmerman Note and the German submarine warfare against them. Number 21, World War II. Finally, Lieutenant Dan has a relative die in World War II. World War II was caused by fascist nations trying to conquer. It featured 2 main theaters, Europe and the Pacific, resulting in an Allied victory. Number 22, Charlie. This was, of course, a nickname for something or someone in the context of the Vietnam War. The U.S. enemy in the Vietnam War was the communist North Vietnamese. North Vietnamese insurgents in South Vietnam were called the Viet Cong, or Charlie. Number 23, the Cu Chi Tunnels. A scene shows Forrest going headfirst into an underground tunnel in Vietnam. The tunnels were a series of underground hideouts for the Viet Cong, that's the North Vietnamese communist insurgents in South Vietnam. Forrest was a, quote, tunnel rat going in to investigate. Number 24, Hippies. As Forrest writes to Jenny, a scene features her transition to the hippie counterculture. The hippies were the counterculture of the 1960s. Many rejected mainstream society, questioned government, protested war, listened to rock music, and practiced drug use. Number 25, Napalm. Lieutenant Dan orders napalm strikes. Napalm, it's a flammable gel, and Agent Orange, which is an herbicide, were used to destroy Vietnamese forests. Agent Orange in particular is known to have lasting effects on people. Number 26, ice cream. Forrest was eating ice cream while recovering from his wounds. The United States installed a number of ice cream plants in South Vietnam. This was to improve the morale of troops. Number 27, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Forrest met with Johnson for his service in Vietnam. LBJ's domestic legacy is very positive: civil rights legislation, the Great Society, etc. But his foreign policy is disastrous, escalating the Vietnam War to unprecedented levels. Number 28, anti-war protests. Forrest is in an anti-war protest in D.C. by accident. The increased protests against the war encouraged politicians to have platforms that included plans to get out of Vietnam. This was true for eventual President Richard Nixon. Number 29, the Black Panthers. Forrest stumbles into a Black Panther Party gathering with Jenny. The Panthers were a militant socialist group established by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in 1965. Their goals were to overthrow the government and separate the races. Number 30, SDS. Jenny's boyfriend was with the Students for a Democratic Society. These activists promoted socialism. The Cold War was an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. A socialist group like SDS was a direct challenge to America's Cold War position. Number 31, the space race. Forrest has the moon landing on television featuring Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Since the launching of Sputnik, which was in 1958, the Soviets had always beaten the Americans in space race milestones, but the lunar landing was a huge victory for the Americans. Number 32, Ping-Pong Diplomacy. As a ping-pong prodigy, Forrest is invited to play in China. In real history, when U.S. ping-pong players were invited to China, it opened an opportunity for Nixon to visit China and establish diplomatic relations known as ping-pong diplomacy. Number 33, John Lennon. This notorious Beatle member was on the Dick Cavett show with Forrest. President Nixon actually tried to unsuccessfully deport him to England. Lennon was very outspoken against the U.S. government and against war in general, the Vietnam War in particular. Number 34, Bob Hope. Forrest and Lieutenant Dan were watching television during Christmas of 1970. In 1970 and 1971, NBC filmed live broadcasts from Vietnam of Bob Hope and others in front of U.S. troops. This was an effort to boost troop morale. Number 35. The Jesus Movement. Lieutenant Dan asks Forrest if he found Jesus yet, then complains about recent conversations on the topic. Sometimes known as Jesus freaks, the Jesus movement was a subculture within hippie counterculture. It was a revival that influenced Christian culture afterward, including music. Number 36. Richard Nixon. Forrest meets with President Nixon after his China visit. Nixon's foreign policy is generally seen as positive. He improved relations with the Soviets, known as détente, and the Chinese, with Ping-Pong Diplomacy, while getting the U.S. out of Vietnam. Number 37. Watergate Scandal. Forrest phones in what would become the Watergate Scandal. The real Watergate Scandal was, of course, a break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters, which ultimately tied to Nixon, led to him resigning from office. Number 38. Drug use. Jenny is shown partaking with various controlled substances. The hippies were known to experiment with many categories of drugs, from marijuana to methamphetamines to LSD, PCP, cocaine, and heroin. Number 39. President Gerald Ford. Forrest's television features a second assassination attempt on President Ford. Ford's legacy involved healing the nation and restoring faith in the White House after the Watergate scandal. His pardon of Nixon likely cost him re-election, however. Number 40. Apple Computers. Although he thinks it's just a fruit company, Forrest had invested in Apple Computers. In a free market, citizens can invest wherever they choose. By buying this successful tech company stock, Forrest increased wealth and achieved the American dream. Number 41. President Jimmy Carter. A news story of his collapse from heat exhaustion in Maryland is heard as Forrest begins to run. Carter's legacy involves the Iranian hostage crisis, the boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, and working toward peace in the Middle East. Number 42. Women's rights. Reporters ask Forrest about this. The new wave of women's rights and feminism was able to accomplish much following the civil rights movement, including abortion rights and equal sports opportunities. Number 43. Environmental rights. Reporters ask Forrest about this as well. Environmental rights has remained a force in American politics. In addition to drawing attention to environmental issues, they lobbied to pass environmentally friendly legislation. Number 44. Animal rights. Reporters also ask Forrest about this. Animal rights continues to be a hot topic in politics. In addition to drawing attention to animal rights issues, they lobby to pass animal-friendly legislation. Number 45. The American Dream. As Forrest runs, he helps entrepreneurs with business ideas, like the bumper sticker or the t-shirt. Forrest is helping entrepreneurs create a product that will appeal to people, allowing them to make a profit and achieve the American dream. Number 46. President Ronald Reagan. Forrest's television features an assassination attempt on President Reagan. Reagan's legacy revolves around ending the Cold War and Reaganomics as an economic policy. Number 47. AIDS. Jenny tells Forrest she's sick with what would later be called AIDS. AIDS stands for autoimmune deficiency syndrome. AIDS describes the symptoms of HIV, which is the virus. Number 48. The Iran-Contra affair. Featured in the novel but not in the film, Forrest is arrested for his connection to the Reagan scandal. The scandal was that the U.S. was illegally selling weapons to Iran and using the money to fund anti-communists in Nicaragua. Number 49. The Berlin Wall. Again, this was featured in the novel but not the film. In the novel, Forrest punts a ball over the Berlin Wall and then jumps over it to retrieve it. The Berlin Wall was built in 1962 to keep citizens of the communist world from escaping to the West. It was torn down in 1989. Number 50. Postmodernism. Forrest Gump ends with him wondering if both Mama and Dan are right about God's existence. Mama believed that God exists, Lieutenant Dan did not. This is a very postmodern message. Postmodernism describes the view that tolerance and acceptance trump truth claims and truth pursuits. Again, if you want to take a look at a lesson resource in more detail, check out the link below. Thank you so much for watching. Take a minute to like and subscribe.